welcome back to the Pretty Serious Bike Racing Podcast. I'm Dane Cash, and we are here to talk mostly about the Elite Men's Road Race at Glasgow Super Worlds. We've got some other things to talk about today too, but it's mostly going to be rainbow talk. And I am so excited to be joined, as ever, by bike racing analyst extraordinaire, Cosmo Catalano. Cosmo, great to see you. Looking forward to our weekly conversation.
Yeah, great to be here, Dane. Always a pleasure.
And joining us this week, for the first time in a little while, we're honored that Escape Collective editor-in-chief Caley Fretz is here to talk about
like I should
Worlds.
Be honored. I'm honored to be here.
Well, that's great. I'm glad that you say that. Caley, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dane. Pleasure to be here.
We have lots of thoughts about Worlds. It was a fantastic race. I really can't remember a Worlds that I enjoyed as much in recent memory. It was really, really, really entertaining.
You know who can remember? Johan Bernil. He knows a lot of races he liked more than this race for some odd reason.
He has his own podcast. He can talk about it over there, right? Yeah, so I think there's lots to talk about here. There's a couple other things, too. We can look ahead a little bit to the upcoming events at Glasgow Worlds. So buckle up. It's going to be a fun show. But first, I got to tell you that everything we do here on this podcast, also everything that we do over on the placeholders, Wheel Talk, Geek Warning, every other podcast that we sometimes do in July, is all supported by our members here. Everything we do over at the website, escapecollective.com, it's all member-funded. So you should go become a member if you're not already. Head on over to escapecollective.com/join and sign up to become a member if you're not already. If you already are a member and you're listening, we thank you. We are very grateful. And we appreciate that you are a part of our very cool community. If you're not, well, come be part of our very cool community. Again, escapecollective.com/join. We'd love to have you. All right. Elite Men's Road Race happens in August. This is a very rare occurrence because we have Super Worlds going on. It's one of the first events of the whole thing. It's weird to be watching a Worlds road race in August, but like I said, I kind of loved it. Caley, because you're here, because we're so honored by your presence, can you take us through, a 30-second rundown just to set the scene? I'm sure our listeners watched Worlds because they're pretty serious about bike racing, but just set the scene. What happened at the race?
Well, and also because I wrote the report yesterday, so that's the real reason why you're throwing to me right now.
That is, yes.
271.1 kilometers finishing in Glasgow with those sort of crit-like circuits. Everybody knew that it was going to be chaos for the entire latter half of the race, and so we had a pretty strong breakaway make its way up the road, included riders like Mathieu and Owen Dool and Kevin Vervecke and a whole bunch of other interesting folks. They were somewhat doomed, but also Mathieu ended up in 7th, so not entirely doomed. Pretty smart, I think, actually, to get up ahead of the action. Hit the circuits. I think it was was it 10 circuits? How many circuits did they do? I should actually know this.
I think
it was
10.
A lot. It was 10 circuits, and basically from the very, very beginning of the circuits, we saw a lot of action. It was really clear that because of the sort of narrow course, lots of corners. I think it was 50 corners per lap, plus lots of up and downs, and descending into 90-degree corners, and it's basically a giant criterium, I think, is the way that it was described in a lot of different places. Once riders were dropped, they kind of couldn't come back. And the same thing happened, well, at least everyone was hoping so, with riders off the front. So we saw stuff like 75K to go, 73K to go. Van der Poel goes with a group of 5, Wout van Aert and Peterson and Simon Clark and those guys. A long, long, long way from the finish. That all sort of came back together. We had a bit of rain at 55 kilometers to go. Alberto Bettiol, I think, had probably some of the best legs on the day. If he was maybe a little bit overactive, ended up off the front for quite a while alone. Very, very impressive. Definitely helped out by the rain that showed up while he was off the front. And then we end up with this sort of super group coming into the final 20, 30 kilometers. The same sort of group of 4 riders that had been off the front pretty much the entire day. And we had Van der Poel, Wout van Aert, Tadej Pogacar, Peterson. Was it 23 kilometers to go? Mathieu Van der Poel attacks. He comes over the top of Bettiol, who they're catching right in that moment, and absolutely nobody could hang on to him. He gets a gap. He falls down. He still has a gap. He keeps going. Nobody behind him can catch him. And it turned out that the rest of that pretty star-studded, what was it, quintet at that point, were racing for the rest of the podium. So behind him, Wout van Aert lost everybody else, came in second. And kind of surprisingly, Tadej Pogacar outsprinted Mess Peterson for third, and there was your podium.
I felt like a bit of a dunce when I explained the dynamics of this group that had Pogacar in it to my fiance. I said, well, you got some really fast sprinters here. Mess Peterson is really fast, so Pogacar's going to have to attack because he's going to lose in a sprint. And then half an hour later, he beat Peterson in a sprint, and then I questioned my entire worldview.
But if you're looking for sort of like something to sum up just how hard the day was, there's your perfect little anecdote, right? Yep. Which is the fact that Tadej Pogacar, who is definitely not a better sprinter than Mess Peterson, beat Mess Peterson in a sprint at the end of 271.1 kilometers. So a kind of a useful place to define the entire day, which was that it was an incredibly, incredibly difficult criterium-like, punchy, painful Worlds.
Yeah, it's sort of in that way reminiscent of Casper Asgreen beating Mathieu van der Poel in a sprint at Flanders, Matt Hayman beating Tom Bonen in a sprint at Roubaix. The latter one, like one of the wildest things that we've seen, Matt Hayman beating Bonen in a sprint. So yeah, I think the attritional nature of this course. To me, the really wacky thing about the course is that if you look at the climbs, I mean, none of them are that challenging. They're so short. All of these, they're very steep, but none of them are that challenging. They're very short. But over the course of, like you said, all of those laps, all of those corners over the course of the day, it seemed like this was a brutal race. And I mean, even with like 50K to go, the quote-unquote peloton was just shredded to pieces.
It was incredibly classics-like. Like I think even that sort of double escape we saw, where we had the same top contenders kind of poke clear at 74K and then at 40K. I think having watched the junior race, a lot of teams maybe adjusted their strategy to, look at the entrance to the circuits here as sort of the Forest of Arenberg of this course, because we saw a lot of the top teams absolutely smash as soon as they got onto the circuits, string it out, break it up. And you sort of had this pattern of attack and regroup that you generally don't see outside of a classic. And I think that was good. I definitely enjoyed watching it.
The attacks, the pressure put on the front by various teams. I mean, there was, when I wrote the preview, there was a sense in my mind that you can't completely count out the possibility of a bunch sprint, but it didn't seem likely. But, there are teams that have brought a Jasper Philipsen to this race just in case. And it was pretty clear very early that's not going to happen. With the amount of pressure that the team, I mean, like we have written here on the run sheet, with the Denmarks and the Belgiums kind of pushing really hard at the front, it was not going to happen. And a lot of those sprinters are dropped super early, making it very clear that this was going to be a very small group fighting for the win.
I mean, there were sections of the course where literally you could only get maybe two riders wide through a corner, right? And so actually some of them maybe even one. So all it would take was the person on the front to be just doing tempo, and the entire latter half of the peloton is doing a series of sprints after every single corner for 50 corners, every single lap for 10 laps. Like, there was just absolutely no way that anybody in the latter half of the peloton when they entered the circuits was going to be there for more than like a lap or two, because it didn't matter how strong they were. It was going to be absolutely impossible. I saw a tweet, I think it was from Greg Henderson. Folks who've been watching the sport for a long time will remember that name. And I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have the tweet in front of me. Basically, it was a similar event. I think it was actually in the U.S. And he came in third with an average power of 300 watts. And Edvald Bosenhagen dropped out with an average power of 370 watts. And that's basically his thing was, well, that's how you race criteriums. Like, if you know how to race crits, if you know where to be, if you know how to do the corners, if you know how to race these things and how to succeed in them, then it's a massive, massive advantage. Which kind of brings me to the topic that we do need to discuss, I think, which is the fact that a lot of folks ahead of this race said the course was terrible for various different reasons. They either said it was dangerous, or they said it just like wasn't proper, or I didn't even, like, a lot of them weren't even actually really explaining why they didn't like it. It just sort of it isn't much. It isn't like a lot of Worlds courses we've seen in the past. Lo and behold, most of the teams that had people complaining about the course didn't do particularly well. The French, for example, were basically nowhere to be seen and sort of rode themselves right out of the race a couple different times. It was a very unique circuit, and I think that the riders that embraced that and that kind of loved it were the ones that ended up doing a lot better, and also the ones that that generally just knew where to be, which was at the front.
Yeah, that's right in line with what Palace said in his post-race interview, was that the battle for position was super hot, but it was 1,000% worth it. Like, if you could get where you needed to be, the payoff was there, and it was there more and more as the race went on. And I think maybe I'm jumping ahead on the run sheet a little bit, but having Pogačar in a bright green kit and relatively thin on teammates made a very cool, as you're watching the race, indicator, how much work he did just staying close to the front. Like, you would see him sort of pop out at the back of the train for a second or two, on kind of a front-on camera shot, and they would come up a hill and go around a corner, and he'd be, sixth or seventh wheel, and you would almost never see him further down than that. And that takes a lot of work as it's happening, but you end, it's a 300-watt effort keeping near the front instead of a 350-watt effort trying to catch back on. And I really loved the visuals we got to have that indicator, and like seeing the group we saw at the end of these are the strongest riders in the world. There were clearly 4 of them, up there above everyone else, maybe 5, depending on how you count. And it was just incredible to see that little green dot showing you all the work that went into making him in that selection.
Is it worth kind of explaining a little bit why this is the case, like the physics of it? I mean, the simplest version is probably just anybody who's ever been in traffic in their car is basically the same thing, right? Like, if you're in traffic and you can kind of see a ways ahead of you, you can see the sort of accordion effect. You can see the fact that, okay, well, maybe up there they're going quite fast, but because somebody tapped their brakes, now 5 minutes back here, I've just had to slam on my brakes and then accelerate and slam on my brakes and accelerate and slam on my brakes and accelerate. And that is essentially what the peloton is doing every single corner around this entire course. And so, yeah, maybe the front 10 riders are just consistently sitting at 350, 400 watts. The back 10 riders are going from 0 to 1,000 watts, from 0 to 1,000 watts, 0 to 1,000 watts over and over and over again. And so that's why even the riders of this caliber cannot do that for 100K, which is basically what they were being asked to do at the end of this race. And like, so you needed to be strong, but you also needed to be smart. And we did see, as you were kind of intimating there, Cosmos, we saw the same sort of half dozen riders like accidentally off the front on a regular basis, right? And in fact, you could very much argue, now we are getting ahead of our run sheet here, you could very much argue that the final split at, what was it, 2030, something like that ish, K to go. The final group of 5 was essentially caused by a crash, and it was just the same guys that had been on the front the entire day, because that's where they needed to be and where they were strongest. We'll get to that in a little bit, I think.
Well, I do want to say first that those riders at the front, I mean, with this particular race and the nature of this course, it was very hard to be kind of an also ran and still be up there. It was very hard to be just like a third tier contender. And we often see this in races. I mean, you see this in Flanders and Roubaix all the time, actually, where you might get the top favorites make up most of the top 5, But there's a guy, there's 1 or 2 guys, who are there where you're like, oh, nice ride today. They'll never do that again, but they had a really good day today. That didn't really happen at Worlds. The contenders at the end of the race, the top riders who were there were the favorites going in. They were the riders that, in the preview, we gave them many stars out of the 5 stars. They are the riders that generally I think people were picking. Maybe not generally the Escape Collective people I asked for picks, Although Caley actually picked a favorite for once, so I appreciate that. There was a commenter who said, "How come the stars and the picks don't match up?" And hey, I can't make my coworkers pick favorites. Anyway, yes, they were there, and it was definitely clear from pretty far out because of, like you guys are saying, that they had to be up there. They're just sort of accidentally, oh, hey, look, I have a gap because I need to be at the front, and I'm always at the front. All right, so to kind of get back to what you're saying, though, moments that stood out during the race, maybe that made the race. What stood out to you guys?
The early breakaway, I would say, was one of the big ones, which, after watching the junior race, I think everybody knew that mounting a concerted chase on this course was going to be basically impossible. Like a team chase was not going to happen once you get on the circuits, right? Which means that being up the road by a minute or two was actually a massive advantage and potentially made for an easier day than it would have otherwise, right? Like Mathieu Dinham, amazing ride, finished in 7th. If he hadn't been in the day's breakaway, he's not finishing in 7th, right? There's absolutely no way. So that everybody knew this. Everybody wanted to be in that move. It was a really strong move, and it was not given a whole lot of leash. We've seen in the past where at Worlds, some group of riders from smaller nations, maybe they're not actually World Tour riders, they're not particularly concerning to the top favorites. They're given like 14 minutes, right, in the sort of first 100K of Worlds. Nobody was dumb enough to give anybody 14 minutes yesterday. And you end up with, like I said, riders kind of, the whole goal was to get up the road and have the race come to you, hopefully as late as possible. And realistically, the riders in that front group, Kevin Vermarke and Dinham and Owen Dool and all the rest of it that I mentioned, they're not really working any harder than the people in the peloton at that point. So it was a pretty clever thing to make their way into a break like that. Didn't work out really for any of them in terms of like getting on a podium, but like I said, Dinham would not have been in 7th if he hadn't have done that.
Cosmo, you mentioned, I mean, honestly, we've been talking about this since June, I guess. Mathieu Skelmoza being versatile.
Yeah.
This continues again yesterday.
Yeah. I mean, Caley initially put this in the run sheet that Denmark was all in very, very early. They had a lot of riders, mostly thanks to Jonas Vingegaard from the Tour, but also, I mean, they are legit. Like, I'm not saying they stacked the field because they got lucky. Like, they are super strong as a cycling nation now. And they put all that muscle to work very early. And the thing that stood out to me particularly was Skelmoza was one of their last guys hanging around at the front of the race, with a scant 70K to go or whatever it was when things really started breaking down to just a dozen riders. And it's just incredible to see what the different areas he can excel in. I mean, he's done leadouts. He helped Ciccone get the KOM at the Tour. He was up there, I think, second on the podium for sure at Flèche Wallonne. He won Tour de Suisse, and here he is in a very classics like there were hills in the course, but it wasn't really a hilly course. And he's out there, throwing elbows, defending space, staying at the front of the race on this, monster crit. It's really cool to see that type of versatility from a single rider.
Despite the fact that he didn't finish on the podium, Mats Petersen obviously in 4th, still big contender for the race. And I think between Petersen, Skelmoza, Magnus Kort, I mean, the Danes were really strong at this race. They had a really, really, really good team. One of the actual top favorites. They weren't like an outsider. To me, it was Belgium, Netherlands, and the Danes. Just to see that level of strength at this Worlds, on top of the fact that, oh, hey, they just won the last two Tours de France. I mean, it's a moment. It's a moment for the Danes, which is cool.
It's funny how countries do this, right? That like you get this sort of super group. I mean, Slovenia. It's a perfect example. So the most obvious example. Because not only do you have Tadej Pogačar, you have Primož Roglič, Mohoric. Like they have this sort of amazing generation, right? These golden generations, and it feels like we're just tipping into the start of a Danish golden generation. I mean, Skelmoza is relatively young. Jonas is going to win probably a couple more tours. Let's be honest. So it's fascinating to me that this happens, you get these sort of groups that come up together, and maybe it's just a confidence thing at some point.
The only thing I'm going to add to that, Caley, is that while I agree this happens a lot, I think a lot of it might have to do with national funding. I think we saw something in the UK that started, it didn't start when Brad Wiggins won the Tour. It started 6 years before that. And I think, different nations kind of get that initial seed funding to start a serious program, and, success breeds success. So you end up with people who are 5-6 years apart, all kind of coming onto the stage at the same time. But yeah, I agree. It's cool to see.
Yeah.
Caley, the Narvaez crash on our run sheet, on the most holy run sheet. This is something that we need to talk about, because it, as you said, it did make a difference in the race.
Yes. So, I mean, this is a key moment, and in fact, Nielsen Palace mentioned it specifically in his sort of post-race interview as, I think the group was down to about 20-25 at that point, if that, all strung out, right? Like single file, just face to the stem, hard as they could go, and starts to rain, and Narvaez crashes in a right-hand corner, just slides out, from the middle of the group, basically. Probably didn't do anything wrong, just hit a bit of paint, hit a bit of oil, who knows. And he crashes out, slides into the fencing, unfortunately had to abandon. I think he injured himself quite badly, at least badly enough that he didn't feel like continuing in the Sufferfest. And that split essentially ended up being the split that would define the entire race. And Palace was basically saying, well, actually, I have the quote right here. There, he says, "I was really bummed that the crash took me out of the front group. It created a separation with about 4 laps to go, and that's when Tadej van der Poel, Van Aert, Pedersen, and those guys got away. I tried to close it, but the gap through the city was too big, and I couldn't." So just to put this in perspective here, this gap is like less than 50 meters, right? At this point, if that. And this course was so hard, this circuit was so hard, and frankly, you look at the names in that front group there, there was no way to close it. There's no way to close a 50-meter gap at this point in the race. And that tells you a lot about the way that this race was playing out, and how, on TV, it looks like this thing kind of comes together, comes apart, goes together, comes apart. But every single time somebody had to drag that group back together, it was just an absolutely enormous effort. And at that point in the race, 4 laps to go, Palace just could not do that. And it was the end of the day for him, just because Narvaez hit the deck, basically.
I think it really was a good illustration of the differences. And I want to talk about this a little bit more later. But in this context, the differences between like a big stage race and splits at a stage race and classics, one-day races, where we all know the rule of thumb in a stage race. If there's a group up the road and they have a minute, well, you could close that over, 10K. Every 10K is a minute. That's sort of like the thing that everybody knows from watching enough Eurosport when there's an hour left to go. And that's just so different in a one-day race when, first of all, there's really no peloton. It's just like 15 dudes. And then also, if you have 10 seconds on a course like this, and if you're Mathieu van der Poel and Wout van Aert and the riders that are of that caliber, that could hold for the whole rest of the race, and it did. And so if you get caught behind a Narvaez crash, again, if you're on some intermediate stage in a Grand Tour, you've got a big bunch behind you, that might not make a big difference. But on this course, on this day, on this kind of race, it makes all the difference. And then it allows this group to get clear. Then, though, I would say, to me, I texted Cosmo afterward because I wanted everybody to come to this pod with the fiery hot takes. One of the reasons that I want that is that I don't even, coming out of this race, I didn't even know what to say. It's just Van der Poel just destroyed everybody in the end. He was perfectly placed throughout the race. There were obviously a lot of tactical concerns going up to the attack. But then when he made his move, Van Aert couldn't follow. And then it was just like, he was gone. He's gone. He was just that much better.
Yeah, 100%. He was just that much better. It is worth noting in relation to that crash, in relation to the Narvaez crash, the reason why those guys are the ones that end up split off the front is because they've been on the front for 75 kilometers, right? You mentioned earlier, Cosmo, if you were watching Pogacar the entire race, I don't think he was further back than 10th, literally in the last 100K, right? If he was, it was for 2 seconds to go get a bottle or something like that. like you make your own luck, right? Is part of what this is, and there's a reason why this particular group gets split off by the crash. As sad as it is for Palace or friend of the podcast Tom Squinch, like the four off the front were the four off the front because they were the ones pulling in the rotation. They were the ones sitting up there. They were the strongest. They had the best legs. So they fully deserved it. I think that's worth sort of saying out loud. And then, despite the fact that these were unquestionably, I think, the strongest four riders in the bicycle race, we end up with Van der Poel making them look like juniors up one of these little climbs, right? And I shouldn't say little climbs, like they're quite steep, but they're not particularly long. None of the climbs on the circuit were particularly long. And when he went, he pulled out 30 meters within 100 meters. Like it was astounding how much faster he was going than everybody else.
He has an ability. I think that's his. To me, that is the number one thing that he does best. Is these 20-second efforts where he seems so closely matched with Wout van Aert in many different ways. And I think Wout van Aert is probably a slightly better sprinter. Wout van Aert's probably slightly better. I don't think he probably is. I think he is a better time trialist. I think he's a better climber of huge alpine mountains. But one thing that Mathieu van der Poel does better, and probably better than literally anyone on the planet, is these 20-second efforts. This was like a double-digit grade. It wasn't very long, but within 20 seconds, everybody's in the rearview mirror, and it was basically race over from that point.
I would agree with that, and I want to highlight that it is very kind of cyclocross-like. He's making a separation with an effort that no one else can match, and then for the first quarter, third, up until his crash, I think, he was really kind of going the same speed as everyone else. He's got good bike handling skills, kind of. Maybe, Caley, if you're going to talk about the crash in more detail, I was just going to talk about his recovery from it. But, he basically, it is that big effort, and then it's sort of matching everybody else, and until their spirits are basically broken. And that's what he did today. It's not something every rider can do. I think we saw a lot of Remco Evenepoel, maybe even exposing some weaknesses. Dane, you want some hot takes? Remco Evenepoel and bike handling. He was able to routinely open huge gaps on the one straight section of the course, and would repeatedly hand them back to the group, over the ensuing corners. And, that doesn't make him bad at bike handling, but it does maybe highlight a vulnerability where one of the three former cyclocross national champions in this winning selection of four could take advantage of him in the classics.
I do, we like to talk about unheralded riders on the Pretty Serious Bike Racing podcast. I actually wanted a whole section for overheralded riders, just so I could talk about Remco. So we can get back to him, because he was very much too many horns, too many heralds.
Well, so can I defend Remco a little bit?
Yeah. I'm not saying he's bad. I'm just saying.
I do think that this is a very unique course that is very unlike, frankly, what they ride, what top World Tour pros ride the entire rest of the year, right? And because of that, just from a pure physiological perspective, I think you're going to see riders who just don't have that ability to do the repeated punchy efforts really, really struggle. I think you could even argue that, Tadej Pogačar, he's probably the best bike racer in the world. He still, I think, kind of struggled today. You could see that whenever there were accelerations, he was the one kind of losing a wheel or two, dragging himself back, because he just can't punch like those guys. He's a Tour de France contender. He's not designed to punch it for 20 seconds in the way that a Mathieu van der Poel does, or anybody else who races cyclocross, to be perfectly honest. So yeah, I give Remco some leeway there, because it's just not what he does. And he said that after the stage too. After the race, he was very open and honest. This course didn't really suit me. He's not as punchy as the rest of the riders. He said that out loud, right? And I do think some of it comes down to handling, but I think a lot of it comes down to you just have to be able to do 1,200 watts for 15 seconds 100 times, and he can't.
This ties very much into the point I was trying to make with Van der Poel, where it's a guy like Remco makes the break and then just pins it at threshold and wins the stage. A guy like a situation like this, which is very cyclocrossy, is a guy like Van der Poel makes the huge effort and then continues making those little punchy efforts rather than having that just dialed straight at the top of what he can handle for the remainder of the race.
That's a great point, actually. And if you watch him, if you go pull up the replay and watch him in the last, particularly like post crash, I think you watch the way that he's riding that course. He's riding it like a cyclocross course, where he is, if it's slightly downhill, he's kicking over the top, and then he's truly recovering, right? Like he's basically soft pedaling into the next uphill kick, and that's kind of the way that you have to ride a course like this. And it was a lot more effective than the chasers behind, who were kind of like head down pushing the whole time, because every single time they got to one of these kickers, he was taking a couple more seconds out of them, right? And it was a very, like you said, it was a very cyclocross sort of style of riding, in that it was on, off, on, off, on, off, as opposed to the Remco just on.
See, listeners, we can talk about cyclocross intelligently. The crash was a big moment. Except it wasn't. Like, it seemed like it was going to be the defining moment, and then no, he got back on. He was fine. How? It was amazing.
I mean, for me, the big moment was not so much the crash, but how Van der Poel recovered. Like, there was zero panic. Like, that is the most panic-inducing situation I can imagine, and he was just sort of like picked up his bike. Like, the car came in behind him. They're trying to get a new bike off. He kind of waved him off. Got back on the bike. His shoe is obviously broken. He knows it's broken. He's like, I can solve this moving forward. Clips in, rides away, comes through the lap, rips off the dangling boa so it doesn't get caught in his drivetrain. There was almost, the time gaps weren't perfect. I think urban courses kind of messed that up, but there was almost no change in his time gap, and he definitely extended it as the race went on. And this is a guy who, I actually tweeted right before he crashed. I was like, the only person who can beat Van der Poel now is Van der Poel. And then he crashed, and people were like, whoa. And it was sort of like, this happens not regularly, but every so often. And sometimes it completely takes him out of the race. Either he's hurt or just mentally, like you can see him, shoulders are slumped, he's unhappy. This was like, oh, I've crashed. Well, how do I mitigate this? It was just very coherent, head in the game from someone who can occasionally get a little spacey. And that was, for me, like, that was when I knew, like, okay, race over. Like, I can go, make another cup of coffee here because this one's done.
Yeah, this was, to me, the opposite end of the spectrum from Christian Nierman on the radio when things happen at Jumbo. It's like Jumbo, chaos. And then over here, Mathieu Van der Poel, cool as a cucumber.
I think it's worth noting that adrenaline can often be your friend. And I don't know if you guys caught this. They showed a close-up of him trying to, like, futz with his shoe. And he had that sort of ankle bounce that I don't know if you guys have ever crashed in a bicycle race, but you crash in a bicycle race, like, you hit the ground, adrenaline just goes crazy, right? And your feet literally start shaking because of the adrenaline rush. And you could see it. You could see this in the video, right? It's like you could see this. It's a very particular, like, ankle bounce that I have experienced many times, and it is basically an indication that your body is currently flooded, absolutely flooded with adrenaline. And I think that that's probably a big part of the reason why he was able to pull out like an additional 20 seconds in basically the next 5K, is because he got turned into a superhuman for 15 minutes, right? I just, like, I don't think I've seen that. I don't think I've seen that in a pro race. Maybe, I mean, obviously we're just not seeing it on television. But as such, like, a direct result of, like, a crash actually being almost beneficial. The other time that has happened in not in recent memory, but if you guys recall the Musette Lance Armstrong crash with Iban Mayo way back in the day, it was 2003, I think, and he, like, got up, caught Iban Mayo, dropped him immediately, and actually said afterwards that the adrenaline was helpful that day. I don't mean to bring in Lance Armstrong into this podcast. I don't know if that's a thing we're not allowed to do, but that's the only other time I can think of where I've seen sort of like a relatively innocuous crash, because, right, he was fine. He slid on the wet pavement. Crashing in the wet is a lot less damaging generally than crashing in the dry. Gets up, pops up. The adrenaline was almost a boost, I think.
Yeah, I could definitely feel that twitch. Like, I knew exactly what that felt like when I saw his foot kind of bouncing like that. It was very, Like, yep, I know that. I also know the feeling of having your boa snap off in the closing sections of a race, and I'm glad that he was able to hang on, but I would really like boas to not break so easily.
I had somebody from Giro text me and say that he should have been running Empires, which are laced shoes, and then he would have been fine.
I roll with Velcro sometimes.
Not incorrect.
No problems there.
Someday we'll teach you to tie your shoes, Dane.
Nah, I don't need that skill. All right. What about moments that maybe pass under the radar a little bit? I mean, the crash I don't think passed under the radar, but there were some things.
The bouncy heel might have.
The bouncy heel might have.
That counts.
That
right?
is true. That is
All
true.
Right.
The only thing I was going to say was that while we saw a lot of really strong teams in the front, we didn't see a ton of the Netherlands up there. And I think a lot of their teamwork may have been making sure that Van der Poel was where he needed to be to not waste energy. Or in situations, we saw a couple of times, Pogačar, probably 90K to 70K to go, tried what he had tried at Flanders, where he kind of snuck a little peek over his shoulder coming out of a corner and then would attack with Van der Poel and Van Aert, 7-8 wheels down, not back, but enough that if he got clear, they would have a couple of riders to get around to try and respond. I don't think the course was hard enough for that to work, but I think it was still cool to see, I'm assuming anyway, to see Pogačar's mind kind of turning, trying to figure out how he can win on a race that it suited him better than a lot of people, but still didn't really suit him. Like we've talked about, he is not the smash 1200 watts, rest, smash 1200 watts guy.
What could other teams have done differently? I mean, is this a case where there is anything? I think to me the answer is no. Is there anything that other teams could have done tactically to win this race? Because it really seemed like Van der Poel was going to win no matter what.
I mean, here's the answer to your question: what teams? What team was going to do it? There's no teams in the entire last 50 kilometers of this race, right? Like, there's two dudes from Latvia. Good job. Well done. France, gone. Who else had multiple riders? We had two Americans briefly because we had Kevin Vermarke and we had Nielsen Pallas. But then Vermarke had a flat or a mechanical of some sort. Then we just had Pallas. What other doubles do? And we got a couple Belgians in there. But really, I mean, the Belgians are maybe the only ones.
That's what I'm
could
thinking.
Have tried something, and they kind of did because we kept seeing Remco do his little attack on the straight flat bit over and over and over again. But realistically, I mean, they had to know that they were riding for Wout van Aert, and they were just hoping that would come down to a sprint and that Wout van Aert would win the sprint. I think that's essentially what they were shooting for, and I can't really fault the Belgian tactics. Yeah. I'm sure the Belgian media is faulting the Belgian tactics this morning, but I can't really fault the Belgian tactics because what do you do? What do you do against Van der Poel on that day? There's not a whole lot in hindsight that you could really do.
Yeah, tactically speaking, to me, it was more Remco needed to be better. He needed to be stronger, and he wasn't. And with that being the case, what else are they going to do? Because I think the card to play is Remco attacks from way out. That forces Van der Poel to chase. He can't be the one doing the. Yeah. Instead, that didn't happen, and there's no way it could happen because Remco just wasn't up to it. He wasn't good enough on this course, and so here we are.
I mean, I think maybe they could have used Stalvin or Benoit a little better. They did a lot of pace setting and not, if one of them had gotten up the road with Bettiol, Van Aert could have been cool, everyone else. But again, on this course, there isn't that advantage of sitting on the back. If the person in front of you punches 1200 watts to get up a little hill, you don't get a lot of draft advantage. You're punching 1120 watts to get up the hill. It's still a pretty brutal course. The only thing I could say is that Mats Pedersen needs to go do more cyclocross because the whole podium was national cyclocross champions, former or present. And I don't know that he's ever raced cyclocross. And I think, we talked about how this was kind of a cross effort course. And Pedersen, he lost that sprint at the end to Pogačar, which is not, the expected outcome.
I also think that Remco should have done the Tour de France, which I've said many times anyway. But the top 20 is all but 2 or 3 just came off the Tour, right? Basically, the gap, I think, was just right where you could get the Tour bump, but you'd actually recover in time. I'm interested to see whether we see a similar thing. I would imagine we probably do, in particular because on the women's side, almost everybody of any note has just come off the Tour de France Femme. But that gap, whether that's sort of the right gap or not. I mean, every time I've ever done a stage race or even just like a big long single day race, you get the sort of bump a little bit after that, and I think that's what we saw from a lot of the riders in that top 20. And anyway, basically packed, right? Tour packed. Maybe a bit of sort of selection bias there, and that the best riders generally end up at the Tour de France, and the best riders are also going to end up at the front of the World Championships. But it certainly proves that the Tour was not a negative for those riders, right? And yeah, maybe there's something to it. Maybe there's that sort of like that post-tour bump, the extra gear. I think, was it Van der Poel was talking about, oh, now I understand the sort of the post-Grand Tour extra gear. Yeah, Remco needed an extra gear, I think, is basically what I'm saying. And Belgium as a nation would have really benefited from being able to use him in a more effective way, as opposed to just like chucking him up the road 30 meters and then waiting for him to get caught in the next corner.
Really quickly, because I think it's pretty obvious the big unheralded riders. Dinham, to me, is the superstar unheralded rider of the race. The fact that he managed to finish where he did, and it definitely came down to being in the breakaway, but also he did stay up there. I mean, that's not easy to do. He stayed up there with quite a few impressive names and ultimately finished 7th in the race. I was extremely impressed that the 23-year-old Australian, our Matt Denif, has a story coming on that front, so that's exciting. And yeah, just chapeau to Matt Dinham. That was a really, 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 really great ride.
I think he's like raced enduro as well. He's raced everything. He's a really interesting guy. So yeah, keep an eye out for that story from Matt.
The other obvious one here, I think he gets some heralding in Escape Collective media for obvious reasons, but he maybe doesn't get enough heralding in general. A guy coming from a country of, how many people live in Latvia? Let's check. I want to get this right. There are,
I think it's just him and Chris Nealon's.
Yeah, that's it. That's the whole country. It's less than 2 million people in Latvia, and Latvia was a presence in this race. So hats off, Tom Scoinch. It was a hell of a Worlds.
It was a really good Worlds.
I want to see. I know production wise and distribution wise it'd be super complicated, but it seemed like there was a really cool battle for that kind of 5th spot. And I would have liked to see more of it. We got little bit snippets here and there, but I have no idea how Stefan Kung really came to be in that, how that battle went, because I mean that group is gone, right? There's no like that. You're basically at the front of a separate race with a bunch of really tired people who still want a good result. And I have, maybe it's just because that tends to be where I end up in road races, but I'm always curious about how those things play out at the kind of top level.
Yeah, I agree. I wish we'd seen some more of that. All right, overarching takeaways. We close out the elite men's race with some overarching takeaways, and I'll kick it off because I think I came away from this race thinking about Van der Poel's season and how incredible his season has been. This has been... it's been a year where, generally speaking, every time he's won a big race, he's been a favorite, but he's not been the odds-on, clear, obvious guy. And then he goes and just destroys everybody. And it's sort of this thing where you look back in hindsight, and you say, well, how did we not see that coming? Well, it's something where I think, generally speaking, if you look at his Flanders wins, his 2 wins, he went at San Remo and he won at Roubaix earlier this year. He's come in, again, as a favorite, but there's this, to me, it kind of reminds me of Mikov Kwiatkowski during some of his big wins where, yes, he's obviously among the favorites. He has this very versatile skill set, but he kind of tends to go, not quiet, but he doesn't always let us know when he's about to, go beast mode. He doesn't, it's not something that he telegraphs in the races coming up to something. At the Tour de France this year, for instance, we didn't see Van der Poel doing his own thing. He was largely riding in support of a teammate. So going into this race, he looked good. He was certainly one of the favorites, but it wasn't like everybody knew he was going to blow everybody away. And that's true of when he won Flanders last year. That's true of San Remo and Roubaix this year, where I think it was kind of all eyes on Wout van Aert most of the time, all eyes on Belgium. And then that's when he goes into his best.
So we talked a little bit about the sort of Wout van Aert versus Van der Poel, what they're like sort of physiologically as athletes earlier. I think one of the other things that's worth mentioning is I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that Wout van Aert's a lot more resilient than Mathieu van der Poel in terms of like physical resilient, but like Grand Tours, that's what they require, right? And one of the things that you look for in a Grand Tour contender is, it's the ability to recover day after day after day after day after day. Go into that third week. They often say that the Tour de France is essentially won by whoever gets slower the least, gets the least amount slower. And I think that one of the things that we're learning, maybe this year is the most obvious example of this, is that Mathieu van der Poel is maybe not as resilient in that sort of use of the word. We saw him last year try to do the Giro and the Tour. Tour absolutely sucked, right? Like, just couldn't do it. Couldn't come back. We see this year he takes the Tour. Maybe now we can see purposefully slightly more relaxed than he would have. Yes, he had a bunch of days in breakaways, but very little stress on himself. Very few stages where he was trying to actually win the bike race. Clearly, I think now came in maybe slightly undercooked with the intention of using this as like the world's biggest training camp for the World Championships. And I think that really worked for him, as opposed to Wout van Aert, who is just a different type of rider, is frankly more versatile, I think, because of this resilience, because of his ability to win mountain stages in the third week of the Tour de France, things like that. These two riders that have come up next to each other. I mean, everyone keeps posting that photo from, was it 2011 or 2012 or whatever it was, when they're juniors sitting next to each other after a cyclocross worlds. They've come up next to each other, and we kind of assume that because they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, that they're actually very similar. But I think they're more different than we think, and I think that resilience is one of the bigger differences between them. It's one of the reason why Wout van Aert has found more success in Grand Tours. And the reason why Mathieu van der Poel has, in general, found more success in these one days. I think that's a big part of the puzzle there.
And certainly in the one days that are the biggest. Because we've seen Van Aert, I think, crush some one-day races. He just hasn't quite done what Van der Poel has done on the very biggest stage. I mean, already, even before Worlds, it was Van der Poel 4 monuments to Van Aert's 1. Now Van der Poel's won a world title, and it just seems like there is, I think Van Aert needs to win a big race again soon to maybe help nip this conversation in the bud about, can he win the big one again? Because it does seem like Van der Poel has a strong advantage there when the stage is the biggest, and that's what we've seen in the past few years. That said, there's still, Van Aert's 28. Like, it's not like this is and he has already won Milan-San Remo. So this is not necessarily going to define his career. But I think he does need to win some big stuff next year. He needs to come out swinging, because this year I think the conversation was generally about how great Jumbo-Visma was right up until they weren't in the very biggest races.
I think that Wout van Aert would come back and say, well, Mathieu van der Poel hasn't, gone for green jersey and won this giant pile of Tour de France stages. And
no Alpe d'Huez win.
Yeah, like exactly the kind of stuff that I don't think he can do. And again, this resilience thing is maybe why this is my little pet theory, is that he's just not as good a Grand Tour rider, or maybe he doesn't care as much about Grand Tours. It's kind of hard to parse the difference there, but my guess is that this is a physiological thing. He just doesn't recover as well into those sort of second and third weeks as Wout van Aert does, who is not only this exceptional one-day racer, but also has this wild ability to get through a Grand Tour and continue to smash people in the face well into the third week, despite the fact that he's relatively enormous compared to everybody else around him in a lot of these stages.
I have two more quick takeaways. The first, he's not an unheralded rider. Maybe a performance that deserves more heralding. Tadej Pogacar is really good at bike racing. I mean, he's just finished third at Worlds. He has won a boatload of big one-day races. He's a 2-time Tour de France winner. And we already discussed this, but he beat Mats Pedersen in a sprint in a big one-day race. He's amazing. He really is. I think what you said earlier is spot on. I think he's the best racer in the world. I don't think it's that close even. It's a level of dominance. It's a level of versatility that a few years ago people kind of talk about, man, Peter Sagan is so versatile. And it's like, yeah, he was, but did he ever win 2 Tours de France? I mean, this guy is next level, and it's pretty cool that we get to watch it.
Yeah, 100% agreed. I mean, who else do you even put anywhere near him, right? Like, just picture for a moment. Close your eyes. Picture Jonas Vingegaard in the front group of that World Championship in like the last 30K. It's impossible. You can't.
No, his CDA
it would never happen.
is so good. He would just get into his aero position and he would coast back on after every climb.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Froome model.
That's
where
his
it's
next
like
step.
He crushed everybody in the Tour de France. I mean, Froome was way better. But in a one-day race, it was like not... his best efforts ever in one-day races were like... Matt Didham has already finished better in a one-day race than Froome like ever did. Yeah.
Yeah, I no question around that. Pogacar is the best bike racer in the world. I think even Mathieu van der Poel wearing rainbow stripes would probably say the same thing. So,
best road bike racer. We may see in a few days how Mathieu van der Poel, more broadly in the bike racing world, maybe deserves
very true.
A bit more credit.
Best male road racer.
Yeah. Okay. So we should narrow it down.
Because Lada Kopecki's probably going to win the World Championships next weekend, and like almost won the damn Tour de France.
Yeah.
A week ago. So, yes.
Yes. My last takeaway was just in general that the excitement from Worlds, I think, really nice way to hopefully build on what, again, I hope the Tour de France and the Unchained Unchained and then the 2023 Tour de France back-to-back potential for bringing on new fans. I think this could have been another good step because it was such a great Worlds. And Worlds is usually, obviously, it's not in August. So the fact that we got a highly entertaining Netflix doc series, great Tour de France, just a really, really good Tour de France battle, and then this, all in a pretty short span of time. I'm hoping it helps bring some new fans into the sport. I'm hoping that people who started watching that Netflix show, who then got entertained by a really good 2023 Tour, and then maybe they tuned in to this race, I'm hoping that they come out of this thinking, man, what a really entertaining 2 months of sports, and maybe I should watch bike racing now.
Except watching this in the U.S. was annoying.
Yep. Just about to say there are a number of broadcasters who will ruin this for anyone interested in it because that's what they do. They're happy performing to 70-year-olds sitting on the couch every morning in July, and they don't care about anything else. It's kind of sad.
My last takeaway is back to the course, which was that it was sweet, and we should do more bike races like this because the Crit World Championships was awesome, and turns out crit racing is really cool. And if you stick the actual best bike races in the world, as opposed to, like, no offense to the sort of American crit scene, but you versus Mathieu van der Poel, probably I bet he wins. If you take the top athletes in the sport and you apply them to a course that frankly isn't seen all that often at that level, it makes for some pretty amazing bike racing. And I think that course designers should keep that in mind. I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the fact that some certain type of person, mostly former retired bike racers, hated it, and I appreciated both of those things. I just loved it, and in particular, given all the sort of the hand-wringing, hemming, and hawing about the course beforehand, I thought it was an absolute success, and I absolutely cannot wait for the Elite Women's race this weekend because it's going to be just as good. It's going to be just as chaotic. I think we probably know who's going to win, I think, but there's going to be lots of different riders that can try.
Just, bold courses. Make a bold choice. Even if it stinks, shake things up. It'll be interesting to watch unless you make a bad, bold choice and it's not interesting. But like I said, if recently retired pros complain, it's probably the right thing to do.
Like if you go all the way back to Richmond, for example, the Richmond Worlds course, right, where it was not sort of the same kind of city circuit as these circuits were, but it had essentially one little punchy climb in it with cobbles. Actually, that was a great race.
Yep,
Piers Sagan won that race. Do something a bit different, and I think that the big takeaway from this course and the way that it's been raced, both in the elite men's race and the junior races, is that you don't have to have, the 4-minute climb to have a course suit punchy, exciting riders.
Right.
That tends to be the standard, right? Which is the 90-second to 4-minute kind of VO2 test climb to separate things out. You can literally have a series of 200-meter long 15% grades, and that will do it. And I want to see more of this because, it was one of the best road races, one of the best world's road races I have seen in years.
Totally. All right. That's Elite Men's road race at Worlds. There's plenty of Worlds action to come. Some quick hits before we closed it out. We're not going to have a big conversation about the Tour of Poland. But this is the Pretty Serious Bike Racing podcast. I'm serious enough that I want to at least mention that Matej Mohoric won a stage race with like some pretty steep climbs in it. And good on Matej Mohoric for that. He went out and beat some guys who can climb to take this GC win. So I was very, very impressed with Matej Mohoric for his efforts at the Tour of Poland over guys like Joao Almeida, Rafael Majka, people who are, they climb. That's what they do. And that's not what I tend to think of him doing. I tend to think of him going on big solo attacks on, hilly but not super mountainous days. I tend to think of him going downhill quickly. But yeah, good on Matej Mohoric for that. At the Tour of Poland. Good on the Tour of Poland for making it through another year without any awful crashes. We've got some big races coming up, as we've said, across the spectrum of disciplines. On the road side, the time trials are the next target. The individual time trial world championships, where on the women's side, the women's one's coming up on August 10th. That's the first one. We will see Marlon Reusser and possibly Chloe Dygert going at it. Dygert's already done some big things at Worlds, and another opportunity here. We'll see.
I was just going to say, I remember watching the two of them chatting at the back of a very small group at the end of a couple Volta Feminina stages, and I can only imagine they were talking shit about what was going to happen at Time Trial Worlds.
Pre-TT trash talk?
Yeah, I mean, Marlon Reusser talks a lot during races, in ways that are slightly intimidating, I think. So at least that's what the ambient mic catches. I would imagine she may be trying to get in Dygert's head.
Yeah. Men's race the following day. Maybe we'll see a Remco Wout van Aert competition there. And then the women's road race on Sunday, where, Caley, it seems like you feel pretty strongly that Lada Kopecky is the race favorite.
I think firmly the race favorite. Who would beat her? Who would beat her?
Yeah, I mean, nobody really comes to mind as a strong, obvious favorite.
I mean, it could play out. It could play out entirely different from the men's race. That's has true. Happened before.
Yeah,
but I think if you are anybody but Wiebes, you're gonna make sure that she's not there at the end, right? And I think that the course is hard enough to make that happen.
Kopecky, how many teammates is Kopecky going to have, though? Like we said, this wasn't a team chase course, but I think Wiebes and the entirety of the Netherlands is a lot of factors in her favor.
I mean, the way that Kopecky doesn't win this is if a group splits off and she just happens to not be in it, and then there's no way to chase it.
Yeah, like a Chloe Dygert attacking from 100K out, that sort of thing.
Yeah, but I don't think that's Wiebes that beats her. It'll be like some second tier Dutch person or something like that who just like slips into something. Anyway, she's my pick. I am notoriously wrong about these things. Although I did win.
Caley, you crushed the
Escape Collective Fantasy Tour de France.
So you're better than you think, I think. Yeah.
It was the first time we have an app now, and it was the first time that I was at the bicycle race. It was the first time I didn't have to like open my laptop and open the browser and like log into the thing. It just like, push notification. You need to pick. And I remember to pick, because generally actually remember to pick is my
yeah, that also, that got me a couple of times, not remembering to pick.
Yep.
In any case, that's what we got coming up. There will be plenty more to talk about on the placeholders, so stay tuned for that. And
we're going to play games.
We're going to play games?
Yeah, placeholders just because we have this podcast now to be pretty serious. Placeholders are just going to get weirder and weirder.
Can't wait.
Sounds awesome to be editing that, Dane.
Yeah, that's going to be
fun. Like a great job.
Yeah. All right, we'll look forward to that, and
we might even have a You're in Trouble. You never know.
Ooh, Okay. Yeah, great. All right. Lots to look forward to this week. So much to look forward to. Once again, before we go, I'll remind you, head on over to escapecollective.com/join. Sign up to become a member. Support all the fun things we do. Well, the very serious things that we do specifically here on this show, and the fun things that maybe the placeholders are up to, and the Geek Warning crew, and the Wheel Talk crew as well. All right. Caley, Cosmo, thanks for the conversation. We will see you guys, well, when we see it.
Thanks, Dane. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Dane.